what works, what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that often produces casualties when you're finding out better ways to do things.
So you're saying there needs to be, it's funny you say this because I know everybody thinks that this exists, but you're talking about a centralized location where lessons learned, new tactics, future technologies is all centralized and then disseminated into...
There are historical units, but they tend to capture the big picture sorts of things. And this is one that would never have come up unless they thought it was a technology to be developed and then spread out. On A teams, and I'm sure on SEAL teams, the way the old guys trying to teach the new ones and that. One of the big things that I think changed between my era in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan is we deployed as individuals most of the time. I went as Delta Company of the first, and we went into Thailand, but that's because we were creating the unit there. Later became 46th Company. But in Vietnam, we rotated as individuals, so you didn't have the traditional camaraderie that you have where a whole unit sticks together and moves and has common experiences. You had people who were constantly rotating in and out and had to make up the team. And, as you know, these teams work closely. And it relies on, personal experience and who you think's reliable and who not.
Very true. Very true. That's something that we ran into a lot of problems that could have been solved if there would have been a centralized location for stuff like that where it was disseminated, because you have stuff you have lessons learned and new tactics, new whatever, within just your team, your platoon, and then you have team-wide, which is a handful of platoons. Then you have your coast of SEAL teams. Then you have SOF in general, Special Operations Forces in general, of all the different units. And yeah, there is some stuff that gets disseminated out to each team. But I mean, even lessons like I can give you an example. Most of it's
personality dependent. Have you got the right people at the right place and interacting?
Like an example that we had was, Iraq in 2005, we're using green tip, armor-piercing rounds against people that don't wear armor. And it takes a lot more bullets to put somebody down with armor-piercing rounds when they don't have armor than it does to use something like a 77-grain 5.56 round. Something with a lot more weight and not as much velocity behind it. But we had to find out the hard way, unfortunately. And that's 2005. That's 4 years after the war started. You would think that would have been disseminated long before that. And so I'm just 100% in agreement with you there.
One of the things that we found was, things you ought to know, but I'll give you a specific case. Sergeant Logan, he was down on Nui Koto that I mentioned before, and they were doing a sweep, and called back. We were the closest camp, and gave me his location with a makeshift code. I think it was Big Nuts Joe or something like that. And he goes in, we'll expand. I just looked at it. No, I know where you are. I didn't, need anything to break it, just looking at, not even knowing which one he was using. Somebody else was listening that night, and they did not make the morning. One of the tough things was there was a Sergeant Logan, and years later I was at Fort Hood, and I forget how it was, but ended up having to go visit his mother. And, that's tough.
Yeah.
Well, we had another one. Again, this is using the same things and assuming everything's going to be okay. I mentioned that we had a company on top of Nui Jai and at the bottom, and that every month they would go up and stay up a month, and the word, of course, would get out when we were going to do that. And there's one, three guys got hit. There was a changeover point where the ones would come down, they would meet, and then go, but they always used the same place. And turned out it was mine. There was a guy by the name of Larry Schmidt. Lost his, well, there were three guys. Schmidt is the one who took a CBU right next to his leg,
man.
Absolutely shredded him. And we went in, well, all three of the Americans that were up there were hit. Unfortunately, one of them thought we would leave him and threw a smoke grenade, which was tall grass, and set it on fire. And fortunately, there had been a Huey that was at Chowduck, and they came down and picked me up. And in other words, we went in and rappelled in, not knowing we were rappelling into a minefield.
Oh, man.
But, I had to pick Schmidt. He eventually lost his leg. It also turns out that they had more than just the mines. I didn't learn until a number of years later that we were taking direct fire from a recoilless rifle that they had in there, and actually didn't realize that it hit the helicopter when I had put Schmidt on there, and that they were able to get down, but it was unserviceable by the time it was.
Man.
But that was a failure of doing the same thing and thinking we did this, it'll be okay. You can keep doing these things without, somebody else learning. The other, like I said, with Logan, our assumption that you could talk on the radio, well, we had people who could speak English pretty well that were just listening. I'm sure you run into that. I had mentioned earlier our problem. We had a fair number of folks we knew that were not loyal to us at the time, too. I said probably 10% of the
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It only takes one.
Yeah.
It only takes one. But, yeah. Well, John, you had mentioned that there are possible dangers to out-of-body experience. What would those dangers be?
Well, again, you're in the highly theoretical area, and the question is, can you be identified being out there? There is an issue of once you're out of your body, can you get back? The cute story I tell about Bob Monroe, because people would come to him and say, can you guarantee you can take you out of my body? And he says, yeah. He said, oh, well, good. He says, you understand it's permanent. So, but, can you get lost out there? I think, probably not, but there are people who are concerned about those things. And it's certainly an area that we don't understand.
That's an interesting point. Has there been a report, or do you know anybody that had troubles finding their way back?
For people who've had trouble, I can't know of anybody who's got lost because we haven't heard from them.
Guess not.
Yeah.
You have heard from people that got lost.
Well, yeah, lost.
Or had trouble.
Kind of wondering about, can they get back? Vast majority said I was there, and most of them actually say they were in immediate proximity to the physical, but there are others who literally go off into the stars and
really
come back. Yeah.
Could you share with us an example of that?
I'm not one specific, but I've certainly heard stories. They talk about being out of their body and usually going up through the ceiling or through the roof and outside, and then getting, just like in the movies, and it gets farther and farther away. But then you also usually transition to a different kind of scenario as to it's not so much a where, but what's going on and all of that.
I've heard people do this while under psychedelics multiple times. Do you consider a psychedelic out-of-body experience and a near-death out-of-body experience the same thing?
Well, the short answer would be don't know, and you'd have to know the specifics. Now, one of the key things about NDEs normally is it's like a critical emotional response. And when I was president of IONS, we would get letters and say, often say, well, I wasn't dead, but, and they would describe these experiences. And the caveat is, but it was like yesterday. So the difference, I think, is in how they're remembered, because many of these psychic experiences, you go, well, yeah, it was kind of weird, but like dreams, it kind of dissipates over time. For most near-death experience, it doesn't dissipate. It's just like, people would write, oh, it was yesterday, and
it's ingrained.
We were just screaming yesterday. Vietnam was yesterday. So there are events that are implanted more strongly than others.
What about, you'd also mentioned something about possible dangers when remote viewing into different dimensions.
Into what?
Into different dimensions.
Yeah. Well, again, we're in a highly theoretical areas and don't know. I mean, I was going to say we're at the front end. The reality is some of this has been going on for centuries, just under other names. We didn't call it remote viewing per se, but we've had psychics that have done things, again, throughout human history, that they would do, interventions and things out there. In general, I would say that the dangers seem to be more in the psychological arena. Folks coming back who are trying to integrate highly unusual experiences and not understanding how that fits into everyday life. I would say that, for instance, with near-death experience, most people who have them rarely talk about them for years. It takes them a while to integrate the reality as they know it and inculcate that into their lives. I saw a thing recently said, 3 to 4 years is kind of an average time for people to come forward and say we have. Now, it is changing, and that's mostly because society has changed quite a bit. When we first had IONS, there were no TV programs that discussed this. And when they did, it was the one with Larry Hagman with Genie, I Dream of Genie and things like that, which is very different from, no, this is a real experience or something that happened to me. And, found that the idea of, a rational aspect of that is, certainly was, you don't want to tell your doctor this, because the answer usually is, I can fix that. We'll give you a shot of something and it'll go away. And, that's been very common. I know a number of people. They will also say there's a huge difference between talking to doctors and talking to nurses. Nurses tend to be much more accepting of these sorts of things. Doctors come from, in general, a much more materialistic worldview. Again, that's changing. What's amazing to me now is how many doctors, like Eben that we mentioned earlier, are coming forward and have had their own NDEs. Now, his was obviously life-changing. And again, as a neurosurgeon, this can't possibly be, but here it is, and now it's my experience, and so.
Going back to remote viewing, I interviewed Joe McMonagle yesterday, as you know, and he had spoken about a remote viewing that he did on Mars. Have you ever heard of other remote viewers remote viewing another planet or possibly another galaxy?
Well, one of the critical things that happened in the early days is that this was with Ingo Swann. And this was before the target, unbeknownst to everybody, was Jupiter. And everybody knew about the rings on Saturn. And I forget whether Voyager had gone out, but had not gotten there yet. And so he came back, and he didn't even know it was not a target on the planet. I mean, it wasn't like he wants to go out and lie. It could have been anything in the world, or in this case, beyond. And he came back and reported a planet, off planet, and had rings around it, and it was Jupiter. And people said, bullshit. Saturn has rings, not Jupiter. And Voyager went by, and Jupiter has rings that we never knew about. So that's when we had authentication. I do hear stories of people who make it, and very hard to believe. There's there's a whole thing going on around now that you can probably find on the internet about that we actually have a base on Mars, and that this gets into the pedophilia thing, and that kids are taken to the base there. And I mean, it just gets into things that are demonstrably false, but does get into the folklore that's there.
Wow, I've not heard of that.
Yeah. And I had, in fact, there was an article that I got stopped that was being printed that said, quote, you think about the logistical aspects of maintaining a base on Mars. We haven't been there, but, other than remote craft. And the quote was, the launches slip out of Cape Canaveral all the time. They said, no, when they launch, half of Florida knows that there's launches. But this is the problem in all of these areas. There is so much BS in there that it's very hard to, and there's some percentage of people who are going to believe anything. So.
Very true.
And I think we'll run into that with whatever we've talked about today, because many of the things we've talked about are kind of hard to believe and highly speculative.
Have you ever heard of anyone remote viewing into a no galaxy?
No.
I wonder if that would be possible.
Well, there should not be any limits. That doesn't mean somebody has or has not done it. The question was, have I heard of it? No. But it's certainly within the realm of possibility. Now, one of the issues that had come up early on regarding the accuracy of remote viewing had to do with the ability to verify the event, that you had to have at some time, as we did with Jupiter, for instance. Yeah, we flew by and saw that it was accurate. So if you get into areas where you can't verify it, then it's in who knows, and going to, at least at current time, foreign galaxies would be different.
Maybe a black hole. That would be interesting.
Yeah, well, there's a whole, there's Joe talking about some of the scientific applications that are in many areas where you can, send this, but we're talking about putting consciousness into an area where they can get accurate information. This has huge implications in all of healing. And a guy we never mentioned was, do you know Jose Silva?
I don't.
Silva Mind Control? Oh, it's a whole school. And Silva has since died, but his mind control, I mean, this is global school that goes out. I was actually a state representative in Hawaii for a number of years, quite a while ago. But Jose had grown up, he basically literate. He was in a big family. Father dies. He's the oldest child, so he has to pick up and make the money. So he worked in a barber shop, and the barber was interested in electronics. And so what he did, he says, well, like an extension course. And so Jose picks up and he says, can I look at these? Yeah. So he learned electronics from reading the barber store and whatnot. But he also found out that he had the technical capability to pick up on, where errors were in electronic systems. And he gets drafted, he goes in the Army, and he goes to electronics school. And almost everybody else is an officer. He's an enlisted man. But he did not know the mathematics necessary to continue. But he had this uncanny ability to fix the radios and things. So what he did was in his course, he traded information. The officers who'd all been to college would teach him math, and he would teach them literally how to use their hands and find errors in electronics. Now, that later changed to doing similar sorts of things with human diagnostics and disease, and very, very effectively.
Interesting. I was just going to ask you if you have heard of remote viewing into the human body to maybe diagnose cancer or
no, that's exactly what he was doing and teaching folks. And
very interesting.
There's people who seem to be more sensitive to, the healing aspects of it. I'll give you a strange case. A guy that I was just talking to, a friend I've known again for decades. I'll give the name of Melvin Morris. And Melvin was known for children and near-death experience. Long story, he ends up in jail in Delaware prison, and had visited him there. But there's a new program out on, one of the things he had done was teach people to meditate, and the effect that it was having on a number of folks. And he said, well, how do you meditate in jail? Because jails are just noisy constantly. And he talked about the process of teaching people just to take short periods of time and be able to get information quieting the mind. The other thing that I'd heard when I'd visited him there is here he is teaching these prisoners how to do hands-on healing. And, this is not, as he points out, most of these are young black folks, and he's an old white doctor, so culturally, totally different. And they would come to him for advice on, medical issues and things like that. And they would teach him some of the cultural issues of how to survive in a prison. But, had a mutual relationship and was able to teach groups that he just normally would not be involved in any of these sorts of things. Said it had a profound impact on a number of them, particularly in drug addicts. Said quite a few of them were heroin addicts, and they were able to teach them how to overcome the addiction.
Wow.
Because even in jail, they would have the craving, but using these meditative techniques, were able to avoid it.
That's incredible. That is incredible. What an impact on the world that could make.
Yeah.
Right?